Howdy. This week I've decided to take a page out of Mark Shumalak's hairstyle book. One of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about in regard to sovereignty of God is that oftentimes we struggle with the idea of how much in this world is our decision making and how much is God's decision making. And the thing is that it turns out that a lot of church arguments over the centuries have been in regard to how much of what happens in the world is God's decision making and how much is our decision making. The truth is that it's actually kind of a difficult way to navigate because in many ways both sides of the argument are right and both sides are not quite right either. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to read a passage from Romans and talk about how it is that it affects our consideration of God's sovereignty over our lives and what that means to us. Now, I'm going to read from Romans 8. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Now, with this is this question of, well, if we're following Christ, if we believe in him, if we accept him, is that really us doing it, or did God decide it already and we're just following his rules? And then with that is the question, but what if somebody rejects God? Was God also wanting that to be rejection as well? And the thing is that in many ways, this is not an end-sum game where God has more control and we have less, but rather is understanding that there are different levels and categories of what is truly deciding things in our world. So, for example, if someone were to say, why did Romeo and Juliet end up, dying at the end of the book? And sorry, spoilers. But for those who were like, well, why did they end up? Well, you could have one level where you would say, well, they had a lack of trust in their circumstances and frustration, and they took things too much into their own hands or their own control, and you can have all these things in there. But there's also a level where you could say, well, that's how the author wrote it. The thing is that both are true, but they're true in different ways. The thing is that we can look at the decisions we make. Did I eat a hamburger? Did I order a pizza? Or did I cook? And we can look at each one of those and we can say, well, I decided this, I decided that. But we could also look and say, well, what are all the factors that played out? What are all the things in the environment that happened, the things around us that led us to that decision? And we could even say the fact that in some ways, God was saying, I'm going to lead you down this path that led you to buy a cheeseburger. The thing is that all of these things are possible. But here's the truth about all of them, is that they neither take away the responsibility we have for what we decide and how we move forward, nor do they take away from God his sovereignty over all things, and that whatever does or doesn't happen, he can still use for good. He can still do what he has decided to do in his time and in his way. So the thing is that as we're thinking about what happens in our world, both are still there. God is still working to provide ways for us to know him, to trust him, to be called according to his purpose. But whether we decide that we're going to go ahead and follow after him or push him away, that still ends up being things that we need to be responsible for. Because the thing is that if God continues to call us and to say, I love you and I want you to be mine, which he does, then if we push that away, that's on us. And at the same time, if we're following him and embracing him, that's also what he has called us to do. So as we think about God's sovereignty, that is so that we know we can trust him, not so that we lose responsibility for our decisions.